Rebecca Sterling discovered her daughter's secret on an ordinary Tuesday evening in the most ordinary way possible. She'd come home early for once, 6:15 instead of her usual 9, and found Hailey kneeling by the back fence, chalk in hand, solving problems that shouldn't exist in a third grader's world. Across the weathered wooden slats, a man's voice drifted through, patient and measured, explaining Fibonacci spirals using river stones and garden twine. Rebecca stood frozen at the kitchen window, her briefcase still gripped in one hand, watching her 8-year-old daughter laugh at something this stranger said, watching her write numbers with a confidence that seemed borrowed from someone else's teaching. The evening light caught the chalk dust in the air, golden and suspended, and Rebecca felt the ground shift beneath her perfectly planned life. In her world of control and calculated decisions, this felt like the first crack in a foundation she'd spent years building. Someone had been teaching her daughter advanced mathematics. Someone she'd never met, never hired, never approved. And Hailey had never said a word. The house smelled like reheated lasagna when Rebecca stepped inside, heels clicking against hardwood with the rhythm of 12 years climbing corporate ladders. Mrs. Patterson appeared with her coat buttoned, offering that professional smile masking exhaustion. She'd lasted 18 months, the longest since the divorce, paid well enough to pretend the arrangement worked. Hailey was finishing homework, Mrs. Patterson explained in her rehearsed tone, and Rebecca signed the timesheet before watching her disappear into October evening. Only then did she let her shoulders drop, feeling the briefcase weight like an anchor she'd carried upstream all day. The kitchen window faced their backyard, bordered by a fence she'd never noticed until tonight. The elderly neighbors had moved 6 months ago, while she'd been buried in the Bridgepoint merger. Now she stood with wine she hadn't wanted, staring at another house through dusk, lights warm in its windows. That fence sat between them, tall enough for privacy, low enough for voices to carry. On the kitchen table lay Hailey's math notebook, pages covered in neat calculations, but in the margins were drawings that tightened Rebecca's chest, tiny spirals labeled with patterns she didn't recognize. Fibonacci, yesterday's text had said. Her daughter had drawn them with the precision of someone who understood not just mathematics, but the beauty behind it. Rebecca climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with unasked questions. Hailey's door stood cracked open, spilling warm light, pencil scratching paper in deep concentration. Her daughter sat cross-legged on the floor, dark hair hiding her face, absorbed in her own world. She looked impossibly small, impossibly separate. When Hailey looked up, her smile reached her eyes but stopped short of genuine welcome. Rebecca felt the distance between them like something measurable in feet and years and missed dinners. She sat on the bed asking about school with careful casualness. "Fine," Hailey said, and everything was always fine in that emptied word. Rebecca asked about her favorite color, a question that should have been simple, but landed like confession. "Purple," Hailey answered, after a pause that said she understood exactly what her mother didn't know. Rebecca filed it away with shame because she'd been guessing blue for 8 years. They talked for 10 minutes, dancing around real conversation like strangers at a cocktail party. When Rebecca finally kissed her daughter's forehead goodnight, she tasted failure on her own lips. That night sleep came in fragments, interrupted by images of chalk dust and wooden fences, and a voice she couldn't attach to a face. She lay staring at ceiling shadows, phone glowing with 14 unread emails, 3 texts about tomorrow's meetings, 1 message from her ex-husband about Thanksgiving. She ignored them all and searched instead for Fibonacci sequences until her eyes burned and she realized around 2 in the morning that she was crying. Morning arrived too soon, alarm cutting through dreams of unsolvable equations. Rebecca went through her routine with mechanical precision, each action a step in professional choreography, perfected over 2 decades. She left before Hailey woke, leaving a note that said she loved her, and drove through traffic that moved like her thoughts in stops and starts. The Bridgepoint building rose 30 stories above Portland, glass and steel reflecting a city that never stopped building upward. Through back-to-back meetings about engagement metrics and quarterly projections, Rebecca's mind kept returning to that fence, to the patience in that stranger's voice, to the way Hailey had laughed. By lunch, she'd made 3 uncharacteristic mistakes. Her second-in-command pulled her aside, concern creasing her professional mask. Rebecca left at 4:30, something she hadn't done on a Wednesday in 5 years. The office buzzed with speculation as she passed cubicles, her early departure shocking as retirement. She didn't care. The merger could wait. The investors could wait. She needed to understand what was happening in her own backyard. October sun hung low when she pulled into her driveway, painting the neighborhood amber and rust. Mrs. Patterson's car was gone. Rebecca had texted her not to come. The house felt different, empty, larger, as if it had been holding its breath. She didn't go inside but walked around to the side gate, unlatching it with shaking hands, entering her backyard like a trespasser. The fence looked different up close, weathered wood marked by time and initials of children who'd lived here before. On Hailey's side, the grass was trampled in a semicircle where she must kneel each evening. There lay colored chalk worn to nubs, evidence of lessons Rebecca had never approved. She knelt in that worn grass, feeling dampness seep through her dress slacks, running fingers over faint equations still visible on boards. They'd been drawn and erased and drawn again, layers of learning compressed into wood grain. She didn't hear him approach at first, too absorbed in deciphering these mathematical ghosts. Then a shadow fell across the wood, and that voice spoke from the other side. He said hello simply, without surprise, as if he'd been expecting her. Rebecca stood too quickly, grass stains on her knees, chalk dust on her fingers, staring through a gap at brown eyes that crinkled with something between amusement and understanding. Trevor Walsh introduced himself through the fence like neighbors at a property dispute, which they were. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe late 30s, with a face that looked like it smiled often, but hadn't recently. His hands were calloused and stained with motor oil, work clothes marking him as someone who earned his living with tools rather than spreadsheets. Rebecca had prepared speeches, planned confrontations with boardroom clarity, but it all evaporated under his steady gaze. "Why are you teaching my daughter?" Her voice came out harder than intended, sharp with defensiveness. His expression shifted from open to cautious. Trevor looked down before meeting her eyes with directness that made her want to look away. She asked a question about patterns in her homework. I answered. Then she asked another, and it became a habit. He paused. I didn't set out to teach her anything. It just happened. Rebecca felt anger rise hot and sharp because that wasn't how things worked in her world. In her world, education required permissions and background checks, and contracts signed in triplicate. She told him this, her voice climbing despite efforts to stay calm. She explained about safety protocols and stranger danger and procedures specifically designed to protect Hailey from situations like this. The words came faster, fueled by fear dressed as indignation. Trevor let her finish, his silence infuriating. I understand, he said when she'd run out of words. If someone was talking to my son without my knowledge, I'd feel the same way. But she came to the fence. I just didn't turn her away. The mention of a son caught Rebecca off guard, complicating the narrative she'd been building. Who's your son? She asked, hating how it sounded like interrogation. Caleb, Trevor said, and his expression softened. He's 10. Loves patterns, numbers, things he can predict. Then quieter, like explanation and apology woven together. He's autistic. Understanding shifted something in Rebecca's chest, not enough to erase concerns, but enough to crack the certainty she'd wrapped around them. She asked if she could come around to the gate to have this conversation face to face. Trevor hesitated before agreeing. His yard was smaller than hers, but more lived in, evidence of childhood everywhere. Basketball hoop lowered to elementary height. Garden beds gone dormant for winter. On the back steps sat a boy with dark hair and serious eyes, watching them with the intensity of someone cataloguing every detail. Caleb didn't look at her directly, his gaze focused past her left shoulder, but she felt the weight of his attention. Trevor introduced them, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. The boy held up a tablet where he'd been arranging numbers in sequences, showing her a pattern without words. Rebecca recognized the Fibonacci sequence immediately. Beautiful on the screen, clean and logical, each number the sum of the two before it, stretching toward infinity. They sat on the porch steps, Caleb between them like a small, silent mediator. Trevor told her about his wife, about the car accident 3 years ago that had left him alone with a 6-year-old who needed consistency more than most children, about leaving his job and moving somewhere quieter where Caleb could thrive. Portland had seemed right with its good schools and therapy options. The garage job paid enough and kept his hands busy while Caleb was at school. He didn't mention what his previous job had been. When Trevor talked about teaching, his whole demeanor transformed. His voice gained energy, hands moving to illustrate concepts. He explained how he'd started with Caleb, using mathematics as a bridge because numbers didn't require eye contact or social cues. How patterns helped his son make sense of chaos. When Hailey appeared at the fence asking why her homework felt boring, Trevor said, "I simply shared what I knew about making mathematics beautiful instead of just correct." Rebecca listened and felt her arguments crumbling. She'd come ready to demand he stop, to threaten if necessary. Instead, she found herself looking at a father who'd rebuilt his entire life for his son, at a child who found safety in sequences, at a makeshift classroom between 2 yards. She realized with sharp clarity that she was jealous, not of Trevor exactly, but of what he'd managed to create with so much less. Presence, connection, teaching that turned mathematics into wonder. They talked until the sun touched the horizon. Trevor showed her notebooks full of Hailey's increasingly confident handwriting. He'd introduced concepts most teachers saved for middle school, making them accessible through questions that invited exploration. When Rebecca finally asked why he hadn't come to her first, Trevor's answer was devastating. "I didn't think you'd approve. You're busy, successful, the kind of parent who hires experts. I'm just the guy next door who fixes cars and teaches his kid math in the backyard. I figured if Hailey mentioned it and you didn't stop her, that was permission enough." His honesty stripped away her defenses, left her standing in his yard with grass stains and no script. She asked what he thought she should do. Trevor considered the question, his hand still on Caleb's shoulder. Talk to her. Ask her why she comes here. Listen to what she's not saying. Then maybe try solving a problem together. Not as CEO and employee, but as people who both don't know the answer yet. Rebecca nodded because she didn't trust her voice. She walked back as streetlights flickered on, mind crowded with avoided questions and truths she'd been too busy to see. Inside she found Hailey at the kitchen table, homework spread before her. For the first time in months, Rebecca didn't check her phone first. She pulled out a chair and sat down close enough to see the problems without crowding. They worked in silence, pencil scratching paper. Finally, Hailey spoke without looking up. "Mr. Walsh says math is like music, that once you understand the rhythm, the patterns make sense. Do you think that's true?" Rebecca looked at the equations, at the elegant way numbers related to each other. She'd spent so many years seeing mathematics as a tool that she'd forgotten it could be a language. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'd like you to teach me." Hailey's head came up, surprise brightening her features in ways Rebecca hadn't seen in too long. "Really?" she asked. Rebecca nodded, meaning it. "Really? Show me what you've been learning. Help me understand why you love this." So Hailey did, explaining Fibonacci spirals with riverstones from the windowsill jar, drawing patterns on scrap paper, her voice gaining confidence as she taught her mother lessons learned through a backyard fence. It wasn't perfect. Rebecca struggled to follow some concepts, got frustrated when patterns didn't click immediately. But it was real. More real than any conversation they'd had in months. When they finished an hour later, Hailey asked the question Rebecca had been dreading. "Are you mad that I've been learning from Mr. Walsh?" Rebecca took her time, weighing honesty against reassurance. "A little," she admitted. "Not because he was teaching you, but because I didn't know. Because you didn't tell me." Hailey nodded slowly, understanding in her young face. "I thought you'd say I shouldn't bother him, that you'd hire a tutor instead, or that you wouldn't have time to hear about it because work is always more important." Each word landed like an accusation Rebecca couldn't defend because they were probably true. She asked Hailey what she wanted, really wanted. "I want to keep learning from Mr. Walsh," Hailey said. "He makes it fun. But I want you to see it too. I want you to understand why I like it." Rebecca felt something crack open in her chest, some wall between efficiency and emotion, and nodded through tears she didn't try to hide. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll figure it out together. Maybe I can learn too." The smile that lit Hailey's face was worth every meeting she'd left early, every forgotten investor call, every sacrificed schedule. That night, after Hailey was asleep, Rebecca stood at her bedroom window looking out at the fence dividing their properties. Trevor's lights were still on, his silhouette moving past windows. She thought about the choices that had led here, the divorce that prioritized careers over connection, the promotions requiring more hours than days contained, the belief that providing meant presence could wait. She wondered, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time with real intention, whether she'd been measuring success with the wrong equation all along. The next morning, Rebecca did something she hadn't done since Hailey was born. She cleared her calendar for a week. Her assistant nearly dropped the phone, stammering questions about meetings and obligations. She was feeling well, she explained, better than she had in years. But she needed time. Time to rearrange her life before it finished rearranging itself without her permission. Time to understand what her daughter loved. Time to figure out how to be present instead of just providing. The week unfolded in ways Rebecca hadn't anticipated, each day stripping away another layer of careful distance between her professional self and the messier reality of parenting. She started coming home at 5, a commitment that felt radical. The first few evenings she watched from the kitchen window as Hailey made her pilgrimage to the fence with the ease of ritual. On the third day she joined them, not by invitation, but by quiet insertion, carrying a folding chair to her side of the fence and sitting down. Hailey startled when she appeared, her chalk pausing mid-equation, but Trevor simply nodded and continued explaining how the golden ratio appeared in architecture, in ancient temples and modern buildings. Rebecca listened, at first with critical assessment, but gradually with genuine curiosity, as concepts she'd dismissed as abstract revealed themselves as fundamental. Trevor taught by asking questions instead of providing answers, waiting through long silences while students wrestled with problems, celebrating wrong attempts as necessary steps toward understanding. When Hailey got stuck on exponential growth, Trevor didn't explain. Instead, he had her fold paper repeatedly, asking her to predict how many folds before it became too thick. The exercises seemed childish until suddenly it wasn't. Rebecca watched her daughter's face transform with realization that some things grew faster than intuition suggested. She tried to help once, jumping in with compound interest explanations from business school. Hailey's eyes glazed over in that way Rebecca recognized from corporate training. Trevor waited until she finished, then asked Hailey a different question. If you could fold that paper 100 times, how thick would it be? Taller than this fence? Taller than your house? And Hailey's mind engaged again, working through the problem with Trevor's guidance, arriving at the truth that 100 folds would reach past the moon. Rebecca's explanation had been correct but dead. Trevor's question made the mathematics alive. The realization stung. By the end of the week, the evening sessions had expanded. 2 other neighborhood children had noticed and asked to join, siblings named Zoe and Marcus, whose parents worked late shifts. Trevor welcomed them without hesitation, adjusting examples to include different levels. Caleb began showing younger kids patterns on his tablet, his finger tracing sequences with gentle insistence. Hailey took on the role of assistant teacher, explaining concepts with confidence she'd never shown at home. Rebecca found herself staying later each evening after children dispersed. She and Trevor developed a habit of talking across the fence as twilight deepened, conversations drifting from mathematics to parenting, to the ways life had reshaped their plans. He told her about his wife, Andrea, who'd been a painter and saw beauty in chaos, who'd taught him that control was illusion and presence was the only gift that mattered. Rebecca told him about her divorce, about the marriage dissolved under competing ambitions, about her fear that she was raising Hailey to value achievement over connection because that was all she knew how to model. Trevor listened without judgment, a skill Rebecca had forgotten existed. He didn't offer solutions or try to fix her uncertainties. He simply heard them, acknowledged them, occasionally reflected back questions that made her think deeper. When she confessed her jealousy, admitted that watching him teach her daughter felt like watching someone else be the parent she'd tried to be. He'd paused for a long moment. "You're here now," he'd told her. "That's what matters. Not the time you missed, but the time you're choosing. Kids don't need perfect. They need present." The letter arrived on a Monday, delivered to school and forwarded home with a note from Hailey's teacher. Rebecca found it on the counter when she came in from work. 6:03, she noted with satisfaction. Hailey had been nominated for the Oregon State Mathematics Olympiad, a competition for elementary students demonstrating exceptional problem-solving. Preliminary rounds in 3 weeks at the university in Eugene. Students could bring one guest. The teacher had written a personal note praising Hailey's recent progress, asking what tutoring program Rebecca had enrolled her in. Rebecca stood holding the letter as Hailey burst through the door, backpack bouncing, already talking about the nomination before her shoes were off. She was excited and terrified in equal measure, words tumbling over each other as she explained the format, the types of problems, the fact that some kids had been training for years. Rebecca's first instinct was automatic. She'd hire the best math tutor in Portland, clear Hailey's schedule for intensive preparation, approach this like any competitive advantage that money could secure. She'd already pulled out her phone when Hailey's next words stopped her. "Can Mr. Walsh help me practice?" Her voice was smaller now, uncertain. "He knows the kind of problems they ask, and he makes it not scary." Rebecca looked at her daughter, at hope and fear balanced in her expression, and put her phone away. "Of course," she said. "Let's ask him together." The relief on Hailey's face was answer enough, confirmation that Rebecca's instinct to throw money at the problem would have been exactly wrong. Sometimes the best resource wasn't the most expensive one. Sometimes it was just the person who cared enough to make mathematics feel like play instead of pressure. They asked Trevor that evening, and he agreed with a caveat that surprised Rebecca. He'd help with practice, he said, but only if Rebecca participated too. Not as observer, but as student, working through problems alongside Hailey, making mistakes where her daughter could see them. Modeling that struggle was part of learning rather than sign of failure. Rebecca wanted to protest. Her schedule was already strained. Her work obligations still demanded attention she could barely spare. But something in Trevor's steady gaze told her this wasn't negotiable. If she wanted to support her daughter, she'd have to do more than arrange logistics. She'd have to show up as a learner, vulnerable and imperfect and trying. The next 2 weeks became a crash course in mathematical humility. Every evening Rebecca sat with Hailey and Trevor, working through practice problems that started simple and grew progressively complex. She struggled spectacularly, her brain trained for business logic, rebelling against pure, abstract reasoning. She got frustrated when she couldn't see solutions immediately, had to breathe through the impulse to give up when Hailey solved problems faster. Trevor remained patient through all of it, asking questions that helped without giving answers, reminding her that intelligence wasn't about speed, but about persistence. Caleb participated in his own way, often working on separate problems, but occasionally pointing out patterns even Trevor hadn't noticed. The boy had a gift for seeing connections others missed, his mind moving in directions that seemed random until suddenly they revealed unexpected elegance. Rebecca watched Hailey interact with him, saw how naturally her daughter had learned to communicate across the differences that made Caleb unique. It was a kind of grace Rebecca envied, this ability to meet people where they were instead of expecting them to conform. One evening, a week before the competition, Rebecca hit a wall. They were working on prime numbers and probability, and no matter how many times Trevor explained, she couldn't make it click. Frustration built in her chest, that familiar pressure that usually preceded angry efficiency, the need to control what wasn't cooperating. She stood abruptly, announced she needed a break, and walked to the far corner of the yard, where fence ended and darkness gathered. Her hands shook slightly, adrenaline with nowhere to go. She recognized the feeling. This was how she felt in board meetings when consensus slipped away, when variables refused to organize themselves into clean solutions. Trevor appeared beside her a few minutes later, quiet at first, just standing in shared darkness. "You're being too hard on yourself," he said eventually. Rebecca laughed without humor. "I'm a CEO who can't solve problems a third grader handles. How else should I be?" Trevor turned to look at her, his face barely visible in dim porch light. "You're learning something new. That requires being bad at it first. Even CEOs. Especially CEOs." The gentleness in his voice undid something in her careful composure. Rebecca felt tears she hadn't given herself permission to cry, pressing against the back of her eyes. She asked him then, her voice rough with admission, if he thought she was a bad mother. The question hung between them, heavy with years of doubt and overcompensation and late nights spent signing contracts instead of reading bedtime stories. Trevor took his time answering. Rebecca appreciated that he didn't rush to reassurance, didn't diminish the question with easy comfort. "I think you're a mother who's learning," he said finally. "Same as you're learning mathematics. And Hailey sees that. She sees you trying, sees you struggling, sees you staying. That matters more than getting everything right. Kids don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones." Rebecca cried then, quietly, the kind of tears that came from pressure released rather than sadness. Trevor stood beside her without trying to fix it. When she'd composed herself enough to speak, she asked what happened if Hailey didn't win, if all this preparation led to failure in a university testing room. Trevor's answer was simple. "Then you take her for ice cream afterward, and tell her you're proud she tried. You show her that losing at something doesn't mean losing everything. You teach her that worth isn't measured by medals." Rebecca understood then that he wasn't just talking about Hailey, wasn't just offering parenting advice. He was talking about all of them, about the ways they'd learned to measure success and the courage it took to choose different metrics. The night before the competition, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, replaying every practice session, every stumble, every moment of doubt. At 2 a.m, she gave up and went downstairs, making tea just to occupy her hands. She found Hailey in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her math notebook open, not working, but just staring at pages they'd filled together. "Mom," Hailey said when Rebecca sat beside her. "What if I forget everything? What if I'm not as good as the other kids?" Rebecca recognized the fear, had felt it before every major presentation, every board review, every moment when performance would be measured against impossible standards. She could have offered platitudes that sounded supportive but carried no weight. Instead, she told the truth. You might forget things. You might not be as fast as some other kids. But you've learned something more important than speed or memorization. You've learned how to think about problems, how to stay curious when you're stuck, how to find beauty in patterns. That's worth more than any medal. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, sharing fears that tasted like honesty. When Hailey finally went back to bed, Rebecca stayed at the table. She pulled out her phone and composed an email to her board of directors, one she'd been drafting mentally for days but hadn't found courage to send. In it, she proposed restructuring her role, bringing in a co-CEO to share responsibilities, reducing her hours to something that allowed for evenings and weekends, and the radical notion that her daughter's childhood would only happen once. She explained her reasoning in terms they'd understand. Sustainability, avoiding burnout, long-term strategic thinking. But underneath the business language lay simpler truth. She was choosing different equations, measuring success in moments rather than milestones. She needed the company to support that choice, or she'd find a company that would. She sent the email at 3:47 in the morning and felt lighter for it. Some decisions couldn't wait for perfect timing. Some decisions just required jumping and trusting that solid ground would appear, or that the landing would teach her something, even if it hurt. Either way, she was done postponing life until work became manageable, because work was never manageable and life was happening regardless. Eugene sat 2 hours south of Portland. Rebecca drove them down through morning mist that clung to the Willamette Valley, like uncertainty. Hailey sat in the passenger seat, quiet and pale, her hands folded around a notebook she didn't open. Rebecca wanted to fill the silence with encouragement, but remembered Trevor's advice about the power of simply being present, so she just drove and occasionally squeezed her daughter's hand. They stopped once for breakfast, neither ate. When they pulled into the university parking lot at 9:15, Rebecca felt her own heart racing in sympathy with her daughter's visible nervousness. The testing room was in a mathematics building that smelled like old books and floor polish, its hallways lined with portraits of professors whose contributions to theorems Rebecca couldn't begin to understand. Other families crowded the waiting area. Parents comparing their children's preparation, students studying flashcards with the intensity of soldiers preparing for battle. Rebecca watched them and felt the old competitive instinct rise in her chest, the need to assess threats and strategize advantages. Then she looked at Hailey, at the way her daughter's fingers twisted together in her lap, and remembered that this wasn't a hostile takeover or market share battle. This was just a girl trying her best at something she loved. The outcome mattered less than the courage it took to try. When they called Hailey's name, Rebecca walked her to the door, aware she could go no further. The rules allowed one guest inside as support, but that guest had to remain silent throughout the 3-hour examination. Hailey looked up at her, 8 years old and terrified and brave, and whispered, "What if I can't do it?" Rebecca knelt down, not caring about her dress slacks on the scuffed floor, and took her daughter's hands. "Then you can't. And I'll be right here when you come out, proud of you for trying." Hailey nodded, took a deep breath that seemed too big for her small chest, and walked through the door into a room full of strangers and problems waiting to be solved. Rebecca took a seat in the hallway, her phone silent in her bag, and waited. Other parents paced or checked email or made hushed calls about work emergencies. She just sat, thinking about all the waiting she'd avoided over the years, all the moments she'd filled with productivity rather than presence. Waiting felt uncomfortable, unproductive, a waste of resources that could be better allocated. But gradually, as the minutes accumulated into an hour and then 2, she began to understand that waiting was its own kind of work. It required patience she hadn't cultivated, stillness she hadn't practiced, trust that outcomes would unfold without her constant intervention. It was, she realized, the hardest thing she'd done in years. When the door finally opened and children began filtering out, Rebecca stood with other parents, scanning faces. Hailey emerged near the end of the group, her expression unreadable. Rebecca's heart clenched with the need to know, to assess, to fix whatever might be broken. But she held herself still, waiting for Hailey to reach her. When her daughter finally looked up, Rebecca saw not disappointment, but something more complex. Exhaustion and pride and relief mixed together in a way that had nothing to do with winning or losing. "How was it?" Rebecca asked as they walked toward the exit. Hailey considered the question carefully. "Hard, really hard. Some problems I couldn't solve at all. But some of them, Mom, some of them were beautiful. I could see the patterns Mr. Walsh taught us, and even when I didn't know if my answers were right, I understood what they were asking. That felt good." Rebecca felt something break open in her chest, some tight knot of anxiety she'd been carrying for weeks. Her daughter had faced difficulty and found beauty in it, had tried without certainty of success, had measured the experience by understanding rather than outcomes. They drove home through afternoon light, stopping for ice cream despite not knowing the results yet, despite possibly celebrating failure. Hailey ordered mint chocolate chip and ate it slowly, telling Rebecca about the problems she'd solved and the ones that had stumped her, analyzing her performance with the practical assessment of someone who'd done her best and could live with that. Rebecca listened and learned and felt proud in a way she hadn't expected. Not pride in achievement, but pride in effort, in courage, in her daughter's growing ability to face hard things without being diminished by them. The email came 3 days later while Rebecca was in a meeting with her board about the co-CEO proposal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, once and then twice. Normally she'd ignore it until the meeting concluded, but something made her check, some instinct that certain messages couldn't wait. She saw the subject line from the competition organizers. She excused herself, walked into the hallway, and opened the email with hands that weren't quite steady. Hailey had placed second in her age group, high enough to qualify for nationals in the spring, close enough to first that the judges noted her particular strength in pattern recognition and creative problem-solving. Rebecca called Hailey immediately, reaching her during afternoon recess. She heard her daughter's shriek of joy through the phone. "Not first place," Hailey said breathlessly, "but so close, Mom. And they said I showed really interesting approaches to some problems. They said I thought differently than most kids they see." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, standing alone in the corporate hallway in her designer suit, crying over her daughter's silver medal like it was gold. "It is gold," she wanted to say. "You found your own path through those problems, and that's worth more than following someone else's formula faster." But she just said, "I'm so proud of you," and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with placement or qualification for nationals. When she returned to the meeting, her board was waiting with expressions ranging from concerned to impatient. She'd kept them waiting nearly 10 minutes, an eternity in corporate time. She could see them calculating whether this personal interruption indicated weakness in her leadership. Rebecca sat down, straightened her notes, and delivered her proposal with the clarity that had built her career. She wanted to restructure her role, bringing in someone to share CEO responsibilities while she reduced hours to allow for family commitments. She outlined how it would work, what she'd still oversee, what she'd delegate. And she made clear that this wasn't a request pending approval. It was the condition under which she'd continue with the company at all. The discussion that followed was tense, peppered with concerns about optics and precedent, and whether this signaled lack of commitment. Rebecca answered each objection with patience she'd learned from Trevor, from watching him explain concepts until they landed, from understanding that changing minds took time and multiple approaches. She didn't minimize their concerns or pretend this wouldn't be a significant shift. She simply held firm on what she needed and trusted that they'd either rise to meet it or reveal that she needed a different company. In the end, perhaps worn down by her quiet insistence, or perhaps recognizing that losing her entirely would be worse than sharing her, they agreed to a trial period, 6 months of co-CEO structure, with quarterly reviews to assess whether the arrangement served the company's interests. Rebecca left the office at 4:30 that day, early enough that her assistant actually asked if she was feeling ill. She drove home through rush hour traffic that felt less oppressive than usual. She'd won something in that boardroom, but more importantly, she'd chosen something. Presence over prestige, balance over climbing, the slow work of building relationships over the fast rewards of building empires. There would be consequences. Colleagues who'd see this as weakness. Competitors who'd view the restructure as opportunity, the slow erosion of influence that came with stepped-back leadership. She'd grieve those losses when they came. For now, she just wanted to get home before Hailey finished homework, to see the moment when her daughter wrote the last equation instead of just checking completed work later. The evening had cooled by the time Rebecca pulled into the driveway, October giving way to November with gradual transition that would have escaped her notice in previous years. She found Hailey in the backyard, naturally, kneeling by the fence with chalk and notebook. But today Trevor was on her side of the barrier, having come through the gate that neither family bothered closing anymore. Caleb sat beside him, working on his tablet, and 2 other neighborhood kids had joined them, all working on problems Trevor had written on a portable whiteboard he'd brought over. Rebecca stood at the kitchen door for a moment, just watching, and felt gratitude wash through her like relief. This accidental classroom that had started with a curious child and a patient neighbor had grown into something neither had planned, but both had needed. Trevor looked up, caught her eye, and smiled with understanding that required no explanation. She joined them in the grass, not as observer, but as participant. When Trevor handed her a piece of chalk and asked if she wanted to try explaining geometric sequences to the younger kids, she said yes. Not because she was confident she could, but because trying in front of witnesses was its own kind of courage. That evening stretched longer than usual, parents coming to collect children as darkness fell and homework beckoned. Trevor was the last to leave, Caleb already heading toward their house. He paused at the gate to tell Rebecca that Hailey had shown real growth in the past weeks. Not just in mathematics, he said, but in confidence, in willingness to try hard things, in understanding that struggle was part of learning rather than evidence of inadequacy. Rebecca thanked him, knowing the words couldn't convey what she actually felt. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition that he'd given her daughter something she couldn't have provided, and that accepting that gift required humility. She was still learning. 3 months passed like accumulated moments rather than elapsed time, each day distinct instead of blurred into the continuous urgency that had defined Rebecca's previous years. The co-CEO arrangement proved workable once she stopped trying to maintain control of every decision, once she trusted that the company could function without her constant intervention. She worked her contracted hours, sometimes more when genuine crises demanded it, but mostly she held to the boundary she'd drawn between professional obligation and personal priority. It cost her, inevitably. The lead role on a major acquisition, the invitation to speak at a national conference, the subtle ways influence diminished when presence decreased. She minded less than she'd expected. The evening math sessions continued, growing into a small institution in their neighborhood. Word spread among families looking for affordable enrichment, and Trevor's backyard classes expanded to include nearly a dozen children ranging from 6 to 12. He never charged, waving off Rebecca's attempts to pay him or help cover materials, explaining that this was what he wanted to do with his evenings: teach kids who loved learning, make mathematics accessible instead of intimidating, create a space where questions mattered more than correct answers. Rebecca helped when she could, contributing supplies and snacks and her own increasingly competent explanations of concepts she'd struggled with months before. Caleb flourished in the expanded group, his role as quiet assistant teacher giving him purpose and connection he'd struggled to find at school. Rebecca watched him show younger children patterns on his tablet, his patience infinite as he waited for them to see what he saw. Hailey, for her part, took on more responsibility, helping Trevor plan lessons and create problems tailored to each student's level. The confidence she'd gained showed in other areas too. At school, where she volunteered answers more readily. At home, where she talked about her day with the ease of someone who felt heard. Rebecca's relationship with Hailey transformed in ways that weren't dramatic, but accumulated into different rhythm. They cooked dinner together now, Hailey chattering about her day while Rebecca chopped vegetables, learning her daughter's friendship dynamics and academic struggles, and the small anxieties that shaped her world. They worked on homework at the kitchen table, Rebecca available for questions but no longer hovering. They read together before bed, taking turns choosing books, and sometimes talked into the night about topics ranging from math to friendship to the divorce Hailey had questions about, but hadn't felt safe asking. These conversations weren't always comfortable. Some truths hurt to share, some questions had no good answers. But they were real in a way their previous interactions had never been. Her relationship with Trevor remained carefully calibrated in the space between friendship and something more complex. They talked most evenings after the children dispersed, conversations that covered parenting and loss, and the surprising ways life reshaped itself when you stopped resisting. Rebecca found herself telling him things she'd never shared with anyone. Her fears of inadequacy, her grief over the years she couldn't reclaim, her slow recognition that she'd been measuring success with metrics that left out everything that actually mattered. Trevor listened without judgment, offered perspective without prescribing solutions, and sometimes shared his own struggles with grief that still surprised him 3 years after Andrea's death. There was comfort in their mutual imperfection, in being witnesses to each other's stumbling growth. The morning of the national mathematics competition arrived in early March, winter giving way to spring with the kind of hopeful uncertainty that matched Rebecca's internal weather. Hailey was less nervous this time, having learned from the state competition that she could face difficulty without falling apart. That effort mattered regardless of outcome. They drove to Seattle together, Trevor and Caleb following in their truck, the 4 of them having planned this as an adventure rather than just a test. They'd stay overnight, visit the Science Museum, treat it as celebration of the journey rather than anxiety about the destination. The competition itself felt less fraught than Rebecca had anticipated. She waited in hallways again, but this time brought a book and actually read it, trusting that Hailey would handle what came without needing her mother's nervous energy permeating the space. When Hailey emerged 3 hours later, she looked tired but satisfied, reporting that she'd done her best and that would have to be enough. She didn't place in the top 3 nationally. Those spots went to children who'd been training intensively for years, but she received an honorable mention for innovative problem-solving approaches, and the judges specifically noted her ability to find creative solutions to problems that typically had standard paths. They celebrated anyway, all four of them eating pizza in a restaurant that smelled like garlic and possibility. Rebecca felt contentment settle in her chest like something earned rather than given. This wasn't the triumph she'd once have demanded, the first-place finish that would justify all the effort and adjustment. But it was better, somehow. Evidence that her daughter could try hard things without being defined by outcomes, could find joy in the process rather than just the prizes. That kind of resilience, Rebecca thought, would serve Hailey better than any medal when life inevitably brought challenges that couldn't be solved with the right formula. They returned home to spring emerging in Portland, crocuses pushing through soil that had softened with rain. Rebecca felt herself emerging, too, in ways she couldn't have articulated but could recognize. The house felt different now, warmer despite the same temperature, more lived in despite the same furniture. Hailey's math notebooks shared space with family photos on the mantel. Trevor's phone number was saved under favorites. The fence between their properties had become a bridge neither family remembered crossing, but both had needed. One evening in late March, Rebecca stood at her bedroom window watching the math club gather in the backyard below and realized she couldn't pinpoint when exactly her life had changed. There was no single moment, no dramatic revelation, just an accumulation of different choices that had gradually reshaped everything. She still worked, still led, still contributed to the company she'd spent years building. But now her desk held Hailey's drawings alongside quarterly reports. Her calendar blocked evening hours as firmly as board meetings, and when she introduced herself to new people, she mentioned being Hailey's mother before mentioning being CEO. Trevor appeared at the fence, looking up at her window, and made a gesture that said the students were waiting, that they'd saved her a spot in the circle, that her presence mattered even if her expertise was still developing. Rebecca smiled, closed her laptop without checking her email one last time, and headed downstairs to join them. The evening air smelled like rain and possibility, like the particular freshness that came with new seasons. When she sat down in the grass beside her daughter, Hailey reached over and squeezed her hand without looking away from the problem she was solving. In that moment, Rebecca understood what Trevor had tried to teach her from the beginning. That presence was the equation that mattered most, that showing up imperfectly beat not showing up at all, that the mathematics of love didn't require being the smartest person, but just being there when the learning happened. She looked around the circle at children bent over notebooks, at Trevor explaining patterns with riverstones, at Caleb showing a younger student how to see sequences in the world around them, at Hailey confident and curious and exactly herself. This wasn't the life Rebecca had planned, the trajectory she'd spent years mapping, the success she'd imagined when she first started climbing corporate ladders. It was better. Smaller in some ways, larger in others, measured in moments instead of milestones. And when she picked up her chalk and began working through the problem Trevor had written on the board, a complicated equation about growth and change and the patterns that emerged from chaos, she solved it not alone, but alongside her daughter, both of them learning, both of them trying, both of them exactly where they needed to be.